and welcome to the Over 50 Health and Wellness Podcast. If this is your first time joining us, welcome, and I'm so glad you're here. I'm your host, Kevin English. I'm a certified personal trainer and nutrition coach, and my mission is to help you become the healthiest, strongest, most vital version of yourself. And if you're a returning guest, thank you so much for being here. We have a great show for you today. But first, I want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by the Silver Edge. The Silver Edge is my personal training and nutrition coaching service that focuses on strength, health, and vitality for men and women over 50. I help people get into the best shape of their lives so that they can become stronger, more capable, more confident, and more richly engaged in their lives. If this sounds interesting to you, I'd love to start a conversation. You can reach me via email at kevin@silver-edge.com. That's kevin@silver-edge.com. Okay, enough of that. Let's get on with today's show. What do alcohol and drug addiction, the Sahara Desert, income and mortgage loans, eco-challenges, ultra-running, prison, and Matt Damon all have in common? Well, they're all featured in today's story. My guest this week is Charlie Engle. Charlie is an extraordinary human being on a number of levels. He is the author of the book titled Running Man, a memoir of ultra-endurance, and the star of the documentary film Running the Sahara. Charlie is also a recovering alcoholic and drug addict.
Yeah, well, I went to Carolina, and I think I assumed that based on my stellar high school career, there would be a banner on the dorm saying, welcome, Charlie. Like, we're glad you're here, and now our college lives can start. And what I figured out pretty quickly was that I was very average. But I wasn't an average drinker. I was an all-American first team drinker, and I could drink more than pretty much everybody else. And this was the 80s, and cocaine was pretty much ubiquitous on college campuses. And I found my way pretty quickly into that world. And ultimately, it ended up leading me, out of college after 3 years. And I spent the next 10 years after leaving college pretty much in that world of addiction, kind of high functioning addiction, I guess. But, I was always the top salesperson at every job. And I was, I felt like if I could just achieve on this side, then my bad behavior on this side would balance out. And, it took a lot of years of punishment and self-abuse to pull myself out of that. But that's why also I say, I would love to think that if I'd gone to college and I'd been a runner on the team, things would have been differently, but I don't think so. I'm a fourth generation addict. Genetics are a pretty hard thing to escape. And I think the only thing that would have stopped me from the path that I was on is if I had never picked up a drink. But that didn't happen and wasn't going to happen no matter what sport I played or anything else. So I think the die was cast pretty much the day I was born. And, I was going to have to go through this journey of some suffering and learning before I could find my way.
So Charlie goes from heavy partying to full-blown addiction fairly quickly. And unfortunately for him, things are going to go from bad to worse before they get better. He mentions that maybe if he'd been a runner, things might have been different. But as a fourth-generation addict, his genetics would be hard to escape. Speaking of genetics and running, Charlie's grandfather was kind of a big deal in the running world.
I would still argue that he's still the greatest track coach in the history of the state of North Carolina. So he was an All-American in track running at UNC Chapel Hill, and then things were a little different then. The year after he graduated, he became the head cross-country coach at UNC, and then couple years later, added the head track coach to that and stayed in those two positions for about 40 years.
Wow. Yeah. So you may come by some of this running honestly then. He's kind of the Dean Smith of running out there, right?
Yeah, he really is. I'm sorry. Unfortunately, he died when I was only a year old, but his influence was amazing because he, as families do, I grew up being told stories about Coach Dale and about, his accomplishments, but also just telling me that I reminded them of him and that they thought I would be a runner. And who knows if that's actually true or not. But the fact is that when you're a kid and you hear that kind of thing, I think you want to think of yourself in those flattering terms. And so I just thought of myself as a runner from a pretty early age.
Yeah, I guess we could say that quite the self-fulfilling prophecy there. So talk to us about running. When did you start running? What are some of your earliest memories of running?
Yeah, well, I'm actually talking to you now. I've been all over the world and lived all over the country, but I'm back in Durham, North Carolina right now, have been for a few years. And my first memories of running were actually about a mile down the road from here when I was probably 7 or 8 years old and just kind of growing up out in the country. It's not in the country anymore, but, on a farm with cows next door, and we rented a 100-year-old house, and both my parents were still college students, and and I just sort of grew up with this sort of bohemian lifestyle. And I remember running around the front yard in my underwear, in rain, in heavy typical North Carolina spring rainstorms, and just the freedom and the happiness and the joy that I got from running, I think really embedded itself in my heart. It's come and gone in my life from time to time, but it's always there. Every time I look for it, it's there waiting for me.
Running was embedded in Charlie's heart at an early age, and as he says, every time he goes to look for it, it's there waiting for him. And that will certainly be important later in his life. Charlie will go on to be an overachiever in high school. He'll run cross country and track and letter in multiple sports, and even be the student body president. He'll go on to UNC Chapel Hill, where he wanted to play football, but just wasn't big enough. He did play JV basketball with then coach Roy Williams. His dad actually played for the legendary Dean Smith before him. But even though his grandfather was a running legend at UNC, he chooses not to run in college. Meanwhile, life moves on, and Charlie left college a full-blown alcoholic and drug addict. And he's in that heartbreaking yet vicious cycle of getting clean and sober, only to fall back into the arms of addiction again and again.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a common thing with addicts. I mean, here's the thing. Everybody listening to this right now, you fall into a couple of categories. You either are an addict, you have a friend or a family member who has struggled with alcoholism or addiction, or you know someone who has, because nobody escapes it. And the fact of the matter is, when a person like me says at the end of a really bad stretch, whether it's a binge or whatever it might be, like that deep down shame and just horrible feeling, when I say that's it, I'm done, like I'm never doing that again, I mean it with all my heart. And the person, if you've ever heard someone say it, they mean it, because it sucks. Who would choose to live like that? But what happens, of course, is most of the time, a day or two later, of course, you don't feel so bad. And even if you take an action like going to a meeting or whatever, suddenly we begin this process of taking back control of our lives. And pretty quickly that voice starts saying, well, sure, you worked hard this week. I mean, surely this time you can have 2 beers. And for me, I never had 2 beers in my life. 2 beers just always meant that I wanted to have all the beers. And despite the fact that I had never one time ever really controlled my drinking, I continued to tell myself, because that's what addiction does, that this time would somehow be different. And it just never was.
No, it never was. You're right. And you've gone to some really dark places in your struggles with addiction. But to your point, you had brought up that you were highly functioning during this was kind of surprising to me as I read through your biography that you would go through some really dark, bad episodes. But yet at the same time, you had a successful career. You kind of were a self-starter. You had this kind of this crazy hail dent repair business going on. You were making good money, but you kept falling back into that. And so during that time, did you see yourself as an addict, or did you just see yourself as somebody who partied heavily? How did you evaluate yourself, or what was your self-talk like then?
Yeah, Kevin, I certainly knew deep down. I mean, I knew I was an addict. And the major push, though, to quit almost always came from outside of me. It came from a boss. It came from someone else. It came from my wife. It came from those places outside of me. And it took me a long time to learn that until I was going to go to a recovery meeting or to treatment or to make the steps that I needed to make to get clean and sober, until I was the one doing it for me, it just never was going to change. And I always talk about, my son being born when I was 29, and Brett basically was going to change everything, right? Just because his mere presence on the planet, like surely now I could stay sober for him. And a couple months, you know the story, a couple months into that, I found myself working in Wichita, Kansas, and Brett's 2 months old, and I'm in the worst neighborhood in town, smoking crack and drinking and sitting on the ground outside my car while the police searched through my vehicle, and there's bullet holes in the car, and here I am again for the 100th time. And it was only at that time that after 6 days of not sleeping and probably not eating, that I had this incredibly clear thought come through. And that was just that, nobody's coming to save me. There isn't somebody outside of me that's going to save me. And certainly not until lots of people are willing to help me, but not until I was ready to help myself.
So talk to us about that. How did you finally crawl out of that hole? How did you manage to turn that corner and internalize that and realize that, okay, I've got to take charge of me and my life?
Yeah, well, I mean, on that night in Wichita, I literally went to my first AA meeting. I'd been to plenty AA meetings. I just never been to one because I really, really wanted an answer. And I'm not a particularly religious person. I certainly fall in the category of a spiritual person. And in the program in 12-step recovery, there's a lot of talk of higher power, and which I certainly believe in and have, there's a power out there certainly that's greater than me. Let's put it that way. And it took developing an understanding of having a relationship with the greater world and realizing that I didn't need to be in control of everything. So I went to a meeting that night, and I got up the next day and I put on my running shoes. And actually for the next 3 years, those are the two things that I did every single day for 3 straight years. I went to a meeting of some type and I ran as hard as I could every single day, because I thought if I did that, maybe I could actually pound the addict out of me. And because it felt to me like that guy was trying to kill me. And so if I just ran hard enough, then maybe it would go away. And it really took those 3 years of doing that, though, to gain an understanding of the fact that my obsessive qualities, the addict, if you will, were all the best parts of me. Like without those things, I probably would have been sitting on a sofa with a remote control in my hand, doing absolutely nothing with my life. But I needed to stop, drinking and doing drugs because that was the part that was killing me. And if I could just stop doing that, and as my mom used to say, if I could take my superpower, like she literally termed addiction as my superpower, and not as an affliction, but as a superpower. And if I could take that and point it towards things I was passionate about, then I could actually make a good life for myself.
Yeah, that's quite an insight, isn't it? Your addiction as a superpower. And I wanted to ask you about the difference between addiction to drugs and alcohol in what you're doing today. I think it would be easy for an outsider to look at you and say, well, you're just transferring an addiction from one thing to another. Is that fair? I think what you're alluding to there has a little more substance than just, well, clearly he's taking this addictive behavior and just transferring it to something else.
Right. Well, it's always weird too, right? People do still say it, and I've come to understand that in general, those people they have a problem with lots of things, and that addiction is all about being invisible. It's about having no feelings at all, and if you have a feeling, you drink or drug them away, and it's about pain and just being invisible. And running couldn't be any farther from that. Anyone who's ever run or biked or swam or gone to the gym regularly, like when you get in the hardest part of your training or your workout or a race, there's nowhere to hide. There's nowhere to go except right here in your heart and in your chest. And you have to be fully present all the time, which is the exact opposite of drug addiction. And I think that there's, being a critic is always the easiest job in the world. And there's a strange thing that happens out there with like people who don't exercise tend to look at people who exercise and like going, look at that guy wasted his time doing all that stuff. Well, I don't know. My suspicion is if they gave it a try and they actually felt some of the emotional and benefits and the physical benefits, I will freely admit that I might look at the person that I might consider to be less motivated, sitting on the sofa watching TV every single night and say, man, that guy's pretty unmotivated. And I mean, it's not for me to say, what he should or shouldn't do. But, I think that switching addictions is, if that's the worst thing I'm guilty of, then I'm in good shape.
Yeah, I wanted to bring that up because clearly I think for people who don't have a familiarity with addiction, that would be an easy, convenient thing to say, oh, look at this guy. We're going to go in and talk about you're not just running. You're not just a runner. And folks maybe that aren't familiar with you are in for a bit of a surprise here as we go into the next part of this conversation. So you're going to spend 3 years. You're going to go to meetings every day. You're going to run every day. But you're going to go on to do a lot of running. And you're going to go on to do some ultra running. So talk to us about how you get into, I believe, was it Eco Challenge first before your Badwater stuff? Is that the sequence? Talk to us a little bit about where you go from running every day, which I think most people listening to this, they can relate to that. Well, I probably could run every day, but take us from running every day to Eco Challenge, Badwater, and then we'll maybe talk about the Sahara after that.
Well, so I did in those 3 years, I ran every single day, and I ran something like 30 or so marathons during that time too. And I'm the one who usually made the joke, right? Like, sure, obviously I had that whole addiction thing under control. And, and I was addicted to the feeling that I got from running. And people mistakenly think that it's running that I love. My joke is that I love stopping is what I really love, because that's where the endorphin release, sort of, if there is such a thing as a runner's high. Yes, there are those very few moments while you're like out on a run and the weather's perfect and just everything's just right. And I think that atmosphere makes for sort of a high. But it's actually the endorphin release. I mean, it's a physiological thing that comes after finishing hard exercise. And plain and simple, I hit this point where I said, okay, well, if running a marathon makes me feel that way, then what would it feel like to run 50 miles? And then what would it feel like to run 100 miles or hundreds of miles across deserts and jungles? And it's funny, I don't even know, is this going to be a video? Well, I'm going to point behind me anyway, because that map back there that you see on the wall behind me is actually a map from the Borneo Eco Challenge that Mark Burnett himself handed to me as team captain at the beginning of that race. And, I found my way to adventure racing, as I like to say, because I needed to learn how to suffer properly. By the time I found my way to adventure racing, I'd been sober for 5 or 6 years. And adventure racing, for those that don't know, like the Eco Challenge, is 10 or 12 days, usually covering 300 to 500 miles of cycling, running, whitewater rafting, orienteering, navigation. And you have to have a team of 4, and you stay together the entire time. So you're not allowed to like kill and eat one of your teammates. Like you have to, although technically that would mean keeping him along with you, but you have to stay together. So there's the team dynamics of it, but these things don't happen on a flat road. They happen through jungles or mountain ranges so I raced in Ecuador and Vietnam and Fiji and Tibet and Nepal and just these amazing places. And what I really gained from it was a physical understanding of suffering, because sleep deprivation is another big part of these things. A good team will go 10 days averaging about an hour of sleep per night. And, so as I used to say, though, I developed that skill in 12 years of hardcore drug use. So I was pretty good at that part. But the suffering the physical suffering and searching that I learned during those years, for 5 years of adventure racing, I did every single major race in the world. So a couple dozen races, and I just was completely enveloped by it. And I developed a love for what I like to call cultural exploration. I mean, I don't like to do athletics or running or anything just for the sake of doing it. Yes, I enjoy the experience, but what I really enjoy is interacting with people, especially people that aren't accustomed to seeing me or someone who looks like me, and the same back to them. And like, that's what I became truly addicted to. And I was working for ABC's Extreme Makeover Home Edition as a producer, which is another story in and of itself. And I had this trip to the Amazon jungle planned, and I was doing a 7-day stage race. So I started doing a bunch of these things. There's a very famous race called the Marathon des Sables in Morocco, and it's sort of the first one of these, most well known. But for 7 days, just like Tour de France, it's a stage race. So you run a certain specified distance every single day. You have to carry all your gear in a backpack on your back for the whole 7 days, all your food, everything. And the winner is determined by cumulative time. And so I ended up winning 4 or 5 of these big races and developed a love for these things. And I'm in the middle of the Amazon jungle. I'm going to skip ahead actually to what I know where we're going. I'm in the Amazon jungle. I'm in a jungle hammock, like watching the jungle floor be alive beneath me, because everything's trying to bite you or climb in your sleeping bag. And this guy who I never met before just kind of blurted out this thing. And he said, "Hey, have you ever thought about running across the Sahara Desert?" And I basically just said, "No, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Like, why would anybody want to do that?" And, I couldn't stop thinking about it. So it's like he created this earworm. And I like to say that sometimes things said to us by a stranger, just in passing, can actually change the entire course of your life. And that happened to me. That simple question that he asked me changed the rest of my life. And some for good, some things for good, some things not so good. And I began, as you know, to plan this big journey across the Sahara Desert. And I wanted to see if I could be the first person to ever cover the entire distance of the Sahara Desert. And as you know, firsts in the adventure world are very, very hard to come by.
Yeah, so that brings us very nicely to what probably a lot of people know you for, right? Isn't he the guy that ran across the Sahara? He did that movie, right? So, like you said, a stranger in passing puts this idea into your brain, and you think immediately, well, that's ridiculous. Why would anybody do that, let alone how? So, talk to us a little bit about the lead up. So, you've got this idea, but an idea to an execution of something that massive. What does it take to get there? I know you have a fun story that involves Matt Damon in here as well. Talk to us about making this thing an actual reality.
I began to just tell people with no evidence whatsoever that I was going to be the first person to do this. And
Put it
I
out
think
there,
it's
right?
almost
Yeah.
like, when you, right, it probably, maybe when you started thinking about starting a podcast, you may have talked about it for a year or two before you actually did it. That's what humans do. I say we take ideas and we try them on like pants and we wear them around for a while. We don't know if we're going to keep them or not. And I just started to tell people, and people said, like, most people said, you've done a lot of hard things and whatever, but that's just not possible. You can't do it. Like, you can't find resupplies. It's too hot. Like, nobody can run that far across sand. And maybe it's the addict part of me, but every time somebody said that to me, I felt my heels digging in just a little bit more. And I let them own the impossibility of that idea. And I took full possession of all that was possible. I just said, I'm going to do this. And working on this TV show, I had a crazy connection to a Hollywood director named James Mall, who had won the Academy Award for Best Documentary a couple of years earlier. And I went in and I pitched him. I said, hey, I told him about this idea. It was the worst pitch I'd ever done in my life. I showed up late and had a terrible story. And he stood up at the end and stuck out his hand and said, yes, I'll do it. And the lesson there being, always ask. You never know. And he calls me a week later. As you know, he called and he said, hey, I told you we need a production partner. And I just hung up with Matt Damon. And Matt would like to executive produce this project. And he would like to also be the narrator. Would that be okay with you? And I actually thought I was being punked. I mean, I didn't. I fully did not comprehend this, and I did deadpan back to him. I said, I was really hoping for somebody better than that, but yes, that Matt Damon would be just fine. And so now I have 2 Academy Award winners attached to a film project about me running across sand. I don't know why that's going to be interesting, but ultimately Hans Zimmer he did the musical score, and he's by far the greatest composer in the history of Hollywood with more Academy Awards than anyone. But a year and a half later, incredible planning, full time. I mean, my life was consumed with this. I'm sitting there with 2 teammates in Senegal in West Africa, and we are getting ready to start this journey. And there's 20 people around me, film crews, support team, my 2 running teammates. By the way, one of the 2 running teammates was the same guy who asked me the question to begin with in the Amazon, my friend Ray. And, I figured that would teach him to ask me a question like that. I would make him come do it with me, and everybody's excited. And all I can think is I've suckered all of these people out here to the Sahara Desert, and we're all going to die. And about a week into the expedition, that was almost true. Both my teammates were on IVs. It's 140-degree ground temperature every single day. 2 crew people had already quit. It was just simply a horrendous situation. I had to basically evaluate the expedition differently. I realized that I had been so deeply focused on the finish line basically for a long time and going against all of my teachings in 12-step recovery, which is basically that you have to focus on one day at a time. And so on day 8, I had to reevaluate and really get back to focusing just on one day at a time. And all I thought about on the morning of day 8 was running a marathon before lunch. And after lunch, all I thought about was running a second marathon before dinner. And in that way, slowly but surely, we began to make our way across the desert. And it took, we made it. And ultimately, it took 111 days. And we ran basically 2 marathons every day for 111 consecutive days. And again, we had crazy temperatures. We had sandstorms. We ran out of food and water. We had, I always say it's just like planning a business, planning a family, planning anything. You write down the list of all the things that can possibly go wrong, and you kind of think how you would deal with it. And what most people don't take into account is that they all go wrong at the same time. Because that's the way it usually works. It's a cascading thing. You run out of things, then people get sick, and it happens to be the hottest day of the entire expedition. And before you know it, you're lucky to continue going. And that expedition really changed everything for me, though. It was also the launch of H2O Africa. So Matt Damon and I co-founded this clean water nonprofit called H2O Africa. And today it's known as water.org, and it's the world's largest clean water nonprofit with over $1.5 billion in funding. And, all of that came from just the seemingly foolish idea of running across the Sahara. And look, man, you read the book. I didn't run across the Sahara because I thought any of that would happen. I ran across the Sahara because I wanted to see if I could do it, and it was just that simple. And all of the other things were ancillary to that. And again, as you well know, and I'm sure we'll get to in a sec, there's some not great things that came out of running the Sahara. Being well known, if you will, even in a fringe sport can, make you a target. And you saw the film too. The film is, I always say to people, if they ever see Running the Sahara, which you can still get on iTunes, it's like I'm both the hero and the villain of the film.
I was going to bring that up. So for people like me who I first heard you on the very first interview you did with Rich Roll 100 years ago, whenever that was, saw the film. And then when I read the book, I was like, oh, okay. So Hollywood's taking a little liberties there. And I wanted to give you the opportunity for anybody who's seen the film to go, wait, wasn't that guy kind of a dick at the end of that? Yeah. Don't I remember that? So go ahead and explain a little bit about that. And then we can talk about the price of fame being good and bad sometimes.
Yeah, well, and I always laugh about that because I always say to people, look, even if you watch the film, like, why would I, for those who haven't seen it, it basically makes me look like I try to leave my 2 teammates at the end and I'm going to finish ahead of them. And so I just spent 4,500 miles basically dragging my 2 friends across the desert. And it's like, if I had wanted to leave them or kick them to the curb, I could have done it at any time. And I don't know, people may not think I'm all that bright, but I'm also not, I don't think many people would find me foolish enough to think that if I wanted to make myself look like a jerk or a dick, I couldn't have picked a better way than to leave my teammates at the end. In fact, and I've talked to my teammates a lot about it. We're still friends. And I asked them, what was it about? I mean, I had been totally dedicated to them for 2 years. I put the entire expedition together. I did all of this. I invited them to come with me. So what in them made them think that I might actually leave them at the end? What possible lack of trust? In what way had I ever shown myself to not be trustworthy? So it's interesting that they don't catch any crap for actually, because quite frankly, if you see the film, it's their words that actually turn it into me doing something. I don't even know they're having these thoughts. I literally am just trying to get closer to the finish, at which point, I would have sat down a mile before I got there and waited for them to catch me, and then we would have finished together. All of this is news to me. And so it's interesting that nobody ever gives them a hard time. Why didn't you trust your teammate? So if you ever have Ray Zahab on, you can ask him that. But, but it's human nature, and I understand it. And I do freely just like most of the rest of my life, I'm probably 90% nice guy and 10% jackass. And so, you know, the like 3 times I yelled at somebody in the Sahara, all 3 times over almost 4 months of running 50 miles a day and having to manage the entire expedition, all 3 of those times are in the film. So,
Sure. Yeah, that makes good drama, right?
it's
You
a
gotta
reality,
have some conflict in there.
but I actually, what I love is that it creates conversation. I've never been sorry about it. I also say to people, and I believe this to be true, I think that a person who's watching it, the viewer's own life experience has a lot to do with how they view the film. If they are not, people, I don't know, for what it's worth, military, police, fire, teachers, CEOs, anybody in a position of authority is very sympathetic to me. And people who maybe didn't like the PE teacher who yelled at them, or the coach who gave them a hard time, or the boss who they thought might have been unfair, they tend not to like me, my character in the film. I don't know. I just always say, look, I'm not disagreeing with you. It's just that, most of the time any of us would come up short if our entire lives during even a section of time were filmed, and the worst of who we are occasionally is there for everyone to see. But I still to this day, it creates great conversation just like this. And so, I don't ever argue with it. I just say that there's always more to any story. And as you know, I'm going to go ahead and cut to the chase. As you know, running the Sahara, it put me on the map. I was on Jay Leno and the morning shows and NPR, and I got a speaking agent, and I was speaking all over the world, and I got sponsorships, and some cool stuff happened for me. I'm on the board of this amazing nonprofit and a second one that I helped start. And about a year and a half or so after the film, or after the expedition and the film had come out, I'm just out running errands one day, and I come back to my condo in Greensboro, North Carolina, and 6 armed federal agents came out of a coffee shop and handcuffed me and put me in a car and took me off to jail. And it wasn't until the next day that I knew anything about what was going on. But basically, I became the first and only person in the United States at the time to be charged with overstating my income on a home loan application. And for that, I could be sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. And, look, the details of it aren't important, but if anybody wants more, you can go to my website, just charlieengle.com. There's New York Times front page articles right there. And I bring this stuff out so nobody else has to. But ultimately, I was a big fish in a little pond. I had just enough notoriety in 2009 and 10 to be interesting to the feds, because they needed somebody to blame for the mortgage crisis. And apparently, I was your man. So you're welcome, people.
So that was your fault then, is what you're saying. Okay. It was all Charlie Engle. Yeah. Damn it. Yeah, that's amazing, because people can remember back then. Tell me what bank institution went to jail or was punished severely. There weren't any, right? There weren't any, and that's again, people can go on your website. They can Google this information. But just very interesting. You got caught in the crosshairs in this very freaky story and these crazy circumstances, and somehow you ended up doing jail time for this.
Yeah, well, the crazy thing is, I went to trial because I didn't do it. And everybody says I didn't do it, but I didn't do it. And actually, a jury found me not guilty of providing false information on a loan application, because I didn't do that. My mortgage broker did, and he admitted to actually forging my name on the loan application. So one would think like that would be the end of it, but no. I signed the closing package that contained the false information, and I put it in the mail. And it didn't matter whether I knew it was in there or not. I didn't know, but it wasn't relevant. And I was found guilty of mail fraud and sentenced to 21 months in Beckley Federal Correctional Institute in Beckley, West Virginia. And on Valentine's Day of 2011, my 2 kids took me to prison and dropped me off, like summer camp, just a really bad summer camp. And, and I was pissed off when I got there. But it took me about a day, Kevin, to realize and to really grasp the fact that fair or unfair didn't matter. It was irrelevant at this point. Fair or unfair didn't matter. And I had to figure out how I was going to get through this situation. And, I'm happy to say that I actually did what I always do. I turned back to running. And I started to run every single day in prison. And if we were on lockdown and I was stuck in my cell, I would run for 6 or 8 hours sometimes in place. And people thought I was nuts, of course, which, as I always like to say, isn't necessarily a bad thing in federal prison. And, and strangely, though, this law of attraction rather than promotion, people started coming up to me after making fun of me for months. Guys started coming up to me and asking if I could teach them how to run. And, when I got to Beckley, there was nobody running, maybe 2 or 3 guys on a regular basis. And a year and a half later, when I left there, there were 50 guys running with me every single day in my running group. And half of them were doing yoga with me on the softball field 3 days a week. And it was amazing what power people took from that. And I assure you, not once did I go up to someone in federal prison and say, hey, man, you look like you need to get yourself in shape. Why don't you come run with me? Because that's a bad idea in prison. But people are always watching. And if you just live your life, that's why I never, I'm plant-based, I'm clean and sober, and I'm a runner. And unless someone asks me, I never talk about that stuff, because it's not my job or my business to impose my way of doing things. I'll share what I'm doing. And if someone has a question for me, they're welcome to ask. And and I think that that's the way everyone should be. We seem to live in a world these days where everybody feels they have the right to basically force their opinions and the way they live their life upon us. And I don't dig that. And I don't think most people do. But I don't recommend federal prison in case any of you out there are thinking about it. But, it gave me perspective. And the first guy I ever met in there in prison was, a early 60s black gentleman who had gotten a 25-year sentence for a small amount of drugs, 1 gram of crack cocaine. He had 2 minor shoplifting charges, and he lost 25 years of his life for one tiny little bit of drugs. And I'm going to say that my situation's unfair. So I encourage myself and anybody else to always keep things in perspective. Fairness is a relative term.
Yeah, and I think that most of us know the Serenity Prayer, right? And that's a big part of the AA, and to really focus on the things you have control over and just let the things you don't have control over be,
Yeah.
right? If you're constantly railing against those, that's a tough way to live your life. But if you don't control certain circumstances, but you do control your response to those. So I think that's kind of the message you're putting there, right? You've gotten this ridiculous situation in prison, and here you are, you're leading yoga in a running group.
Completely.
Right?
Completely true.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy. It was again, an experience I wouldn't choose to do again and wouldn't have chosen for myself. There was a lot of loss, but there was also a lot of gain. I mean, you probably heard me say my mantra before, but it is that, what happens to us isn't nearly as important as what we do about it. And most people, we think that other people are constantly judging us, and maybe they are to a certain degree, but the reality is it's just like running 100 miles, man. Nobody else actually cares how you do. Nobody can care the same way you do. And yet most of us have this feeling very often that we're always being watched. And that's a pretty narcissistic way to go about it. In fact, most people they don't live their lives around what we're doing. So we just have to keep moving along. And again, I know I'm a little short on time today, and my apologies for that, but I have a big project, a couple more going on these days, the 5.8 Global Adventure Series, which I know you were probably going to mention. And For people that want more information, it's on my website. All my social media is on my website. So if anybody, that's one thing about being over 50, right? I kind of abhor social media, but I use it because it's it's a necessity in life, I guess. So there's lots of stuff on there. And I hope that if I've said anything that anybody wants to talk further about, addiction, running, anything else out there, then I'm a very easy person to reach, as you know yourself, Kevin.
Yes, you are. Absolutely. And I'll drop all of your contact information into the show notes so folks can grab you there. And I really appreciate your time. So, Charlie, thanks again for coming on, sharing your journey, your story, your wisdom with us. You are a fantastic inspiration, amazing ambassador for healthy aging, and I surely wish you all the best in all your future endeavors.
It was really my pleasure, Kevin. I want to know when you're going to invite me down to Carolina Beach to run with you and your group.
Anytime, man. I may not be able to keep up with you, but come on down.
You would be surprised. There's a lot of miles on this body. It's not about going fast.
That's right.
All right.
There you go. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Uno, dos, tres, cuatro.
Well, that's our show for today, folks. We only scratched the surface of Charlie's story, and if you want to learn more, I would strongly recommend reading his book titled Running Man and watching his movie called Running the Sahara. You can also check him out at his website at www.charlieengle.com, and that's spelled E-N-G-L-E. And I'll put links to his book, the movie, and all his social media info into the show notes, which you can find on my website at www.silver-edge.com. If you enjoyed this episode, I have two favors to ask of you. First, would you please rate and review the show on whatever platform you're listening? And second, please tell a friend about this show. Thanks so much for spending your time with us today, and until next time, stay strong.